You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome to episode 14. Today our focus is on inequality. Why is it so bad for societies and what can we do about it? I discuss these questions and some of the related issues with the economist Tony Atkinson from Oxford University. Tony is a world-leading scholar in this field and has researched issues around inequality for decades. So he really is one of the most important voices in this discussion. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Tony Atkinson, good morning and thank you very much for joining us today. You have been working and researching the topic of inequality for a very long time, and you've had eminent publications in the field. Just to get us going, can you let us know again what are the biggest problems with inequality? Why is it such a great social and economic problem?
Well, I think there are two main kinds of reason why one's concerned about inequality. One is, as it were, intrinsic, that the kind of society in which we would like to live is one which at least the gaps are not too big between the top and the bottom. And that's what I regard as an intrinsic reason why we feel that issues of social justice should be addressed. And then the second set of reasons are the consequences of inequality, which had quite a lot of attention recently in terms of their impact on all kinds of social and economic problems. But I think the consequences for me probably are the most serious when it comes to the relationship between two kinds of inequality. One is inequality of opportunity and the other is inequality of outcome. And I've tended to focus on inequality of outcome because it seems to me it's a necessary element in achieving something which everyone seems to agree, which is we should have a level playing field in terms of equality of opportunity.
Yeah, of course, these two are linked. If I remember correctly, I think Anthony Giddens once wrote that this generation's inequality in outcome is the next generation's inequality of opportunity.
Exactly. I think that one sees it in all sorts of spheres, from child rearing to education to access to jobs. All of these things create a very uneven playing field. And I think that's part of the resentment that's felt by many people that they don't start off with the same chances in life, and that's, I think, what lies behind quite a lot of the political movements that we've seen in the last few years.
You've just mentioned this resentment, and we're living in very interesting times because we are living through what might be seen as a backlash against elites and globalization in general. Do you think that sort of the development of inequality in recent decades has contributed to this backlash?
Well, I think particularly through the lack of social mobility, it certainly, I think, has done that. I think also, of course, one must recognize that inequality, particularly of wealth, conveys with its economic and political power. And that, of course, is another feature, which is it's not just the elites. I think it's the influence of the media and other parts of our society which are controlled by a rather small number of people. So,
I mean, if that is such a big economic and social problem, and a lot of commentators would agree with that, and obviously the work you've done also over the years with people like Thomas Piketty and others, that has taken the center stage in policy discussions in recent years. The big question, obviously, is what can be done, and you've recently written a book about this. Summarizing your ideas of how to rectify these problems, and I went through them and grouped them in four different sections, and the fifth maybe is what you call the ideas that you think could be pursued on top of that. So if we dive into the potential solutions, I mean, you seem to suggest institutional changes. You mentioned that public policy should aim at a proper balance of the power amongst stakeholders. What exactly do you mean by this?
Well, I think I should say, first of all, that my aim in writing the book was to try and dispel the sort of sense of inevitability about high inequality. and therefore I was putting forward various ways of seeking to understand why it comes about, and therefore how, as it were, we can moderate it. And I think one of the things that has certainly happened is that institutions, like for example, corporate institution companies, which used to have a broader view of their responsibilities, that they recognized that they had a responsibility in addition to that to their shareholders. It's also to their workers and to their consumers, their customers. And I think it's this broader notion of the social obligations of institutions and, of course, of individuals as well, that we have responsibilities beyond those our own personal economic gains and losses. So I think that it's part of a reaction that I have had to what seems to be a narrowing of a very much sort of individual-based self-interest, which has come to emerge in the last 2 or 3 decades.
Okay, and the new ideas like, Michael Porter's shared value capitalism, they try to sort of not revive the old dichotomy between shareholder and stakeholder models, but sort of trying to align public and private interest in addressing some of the most pressing social and economic needs. Could that be one way of addressing these considerations?
Yes, I think that I think in a sense part of the issues arise because we had in the post-war period some kind of balance of power between, on the one side, employers, and the other side, often trade unions or workers' representatives. And that, of course, has shifted in quite a number of countries as a result of a number of things, including, for example, the effect of privatization was often to reduce the power of trade unions to influence the behavior of those institutions. So I think we've seen a shift of power definitely away from workers towards the owners of capital and those who run firms. So I think a number of the proposals were designed to try and at least make sure that those interests of workers and indeed consumers should be represented. And for example, a good example is provided by the negotiations with regard to trade agreements, which seem to involve only one side, as it were, of that equation.
Well, unless there is the backlash that we now see against TTIP and CETA.
Well, I think the backlash is very much a reaction of those who are outside the negotiating room wanting hammering at the door, yes.
Absolutely. So you mentioned the role of the social partners, and social partners in the role of the trade unions in the social partnership has been diminished in recent years, and sort of re-strengthening this part is a crucial step. Yes,
I think that, of course, I was writing a book sitting in the United Kingdom where social partners are probably weaker than they are in many other European countries. So some of my proposals were things which are already, of course, in place, for example, in Germany or in Netherlands or other countries. But I think also, though, I would want to add to this, of course, I was trying to write for a 21st century labour market, not for a 20th century labour market. And the labour market has changed a lot in important ways. We no longer have so many people who are doing a sort of Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job. We have people whose activities in the labour market are more of a kind of portfolio activities. And that does call for rethinking some of our institutions, as well as simply going back to how they were, say, in the 1950s or 60s.
And rethinking in what way?
Well, I think that one has to recognise that, that people's labour market engagement is now much it's more varied. That we have to think more about the role of the individual as part of a family context, so that it's not just as it were a one breadwinner kind of view of the labour market, and that as a result of that, one has to think about, for example, thinking about social transfers that are not so closely tied, say, to actually being in formal paid employment. So making provision, for example, for people who are only working part-time or who have other activities like caring and so on, to be able to qualify for social transfers that they would get if they were in the paid labour force.
Mm-hmm. But we get to employment and welfare policy in a minute. But you also mentioned that there should be now an explicitly distributional dimension in competition policy. What do you mean by this exactly?
Well, if one goes back to the origins of antitrust in the United States, The bill was a Republican bill at that time. It was directed very much not so much at monopoly power as at the fruits of monopoly power, the distributional consequences. And that was what they were addressing before the end of the last but 1 century. Now, competition policy has moved to being only concerned with the efficiency of markets and so on, and doesn't consider issues like, for example, the impact on employment or the impact on consumers in a distributional sense, of who the consumers are of certain products. And so you see things like, for example, enforced closure of bank branches, which may, from an efficiency point of view, in terms of the way competition policy is run now, seem right. But on the other hand, from the point of view of the consumer who loses an important service, that's simply missing from the discussion at the moment.
Okay, and you already mentioned employment and welfare. I mean, these are areas that are that are not just suffering from sort of traditional problems of inequality, but there are new dynamics coming into play here as well, and especially technological change, the digital revolution as a shorthand for accelerated technological change. You say should be an explicit concern of policymakers, and especially that sort of increasing the employability of workers should be focus for policymakers. But how do you square this with some of the, let me say, more dire predictions that maybe half of all jobs might be susceptible to automation and might disappear in the long run? So how would that policy be enacted in such an environment?
Well, I think it's precisely because of that kind of concern that I was asking the question: who is it who makes the decision? And I noticed that there was a recent McKinsey report, I think, this week, which discussed with a number of car manufacturers what they were doing in terms of driverless cars. And they said quite openly that this is all driven by us, these makers. This is not being driven by a demand from consumers. And so it's a good example, it seems to me, where, in fact, it's not just the car manufacturers are paying for this, it's actually the European Union that's paying for this and the American government that's paying for this. A lot of this development, this new technology. And I think the European Union, in deciding on where it allocates its funds for research and development, should ask questions about whether driverless cars or driverless lorries is the priority over, for example, and one I use in the book, which is one can think of various ways in which robotic technology could be used, in fact, much more easily, I should say, in the home. For example, to provide services for particularly elderly people, but also people with various forms of disability. Now, doing that would actually, in fact, generate jobs because it would allow people to stay in their homes for longer, but they would, of course, need personal care. So it would actually create employment in terms of personal care workers. So, in fact, my favorite example is, rather than driverless cars, is to have what I call chefless kitchens. That is, have robots that make your breakfast, which for many elderly people is actually a major problem, and it's a source of accidents and all sorts of things. And if they could simply press a button and have a robotic aid to produce their breakfast, that would actually allow them to remain independent, and it would also create employment rather than reduce it.
So the government should be more involved in, should we say, the direction of technological change? I think
one has to distinguish carefully between, obviously, the science, I wouldn't say it isn't a matter the government should be doing, but it should, I think, be giving priorities about what kind of technology we'd like to see, in what areas, which industries, which activities. That seems to be exactly the kind of thing in which governments should represent the views not just of the manufacturers, which is what's currently dominating it, but also the views of the potential customers and of the people who work in the industries that are affected.
And obviously, we've run over the recent months a rather large project on the implications of the digital revolution of labor markets. And one of the common themes has been that this is a supply side revolution rather than a demand side revolution. And against the backdrop of already high levels of inequality with their potential macroeconomic impact, a lot of people seem to be thinking about how a further polarization as a result of technological change could be addressed. And one of the key discussions that comes up is that of a job guarantee versus a basic income. You seem to suggest basically a mixture of both. Can you explain what you mean by? That is?
Yes, and the first point I would like to stress, of course, is that I think what's not going to reduce inequality significantly unless we address market incomes. I mean, I think that things like basic income and social transfers are important, but unless we address what people actually earn in the labour markets or in other activities, or the capital income they receive, unless we do change that, we're not going to effectively reduce inequality to the kind of level that we used to have. So I think that's the first thing. That for that reason, obviously, I attach quite a lot of importance to something which I'm afraid doesn't seem to get priority today, which is full employment. Mm-hmm. And I think it's when I was a student, we had unemployment rates below 1%, and we regarded 2% as horrendous. Now somehow we've got used to the idea of unemployment rates of 5, 6, 10%, whatever, and I think that's of course partly a reflection of the macroeconomic objectives which the ECB has been given, which are of course narrower than those that the Federal Reserve has in the United States, mm-hmm. which has a responsibility for growth and employment. And I think we should go back to that. I fully agree with the macroeconomists that we need to have a combination of objectives which involves full employment as well as concern about inflation.
Yeah, but if you look, for instance, specifically at some of the ideas about a universal basic income, especially coming out of Silicon Valley, I get the impression that this is the libertarian version of the universal basic income. The underlying idea is that obviously every product and service needs a consumer. Their idea is that if the technological revolution is a supply-side revolution, we need to make sure that there's enough purchasing power amongst people that they can consume our products and services. So and they might not have jobs. So that's again the basic income as a replacement for jobs, rather than the other version that is sometimes talked about as a replacement for specific welfare provisions. So we basically just hand out money. We fund this by basically slashing public services, because then everybody's got their own money and can buy private health insurance, private unemployment insurance, private pension insurance, and so on and so forth. And they can still buy our products. Obviously, from a European perspective, where the welfare state is one of the key identity points of the European social market economies, that's a highly problematic issue. So, do you agree with that, or do you see that the basic income as a replacement for potentially lost jobs could work?
Well, there are several debatable questions involved in that. I mean, I think the whole issue about whether it makes sense to privatize services is something which we've had a lot of experience in the United Kingdom, and I think the experience has been almost universally negative. So I don't think we should go down that particular route. We've seen the failure now, in many cases, withdrawal of the private sector from key areas because they can't in fact make it work. So we're going back to having public provision of things like personal social services and so on. Yeah. But leaving that aside, I mean, I think what I would say is, first of all, that employment in itself is actually not simply, as it were, a source of income. And one has to recognize that in societies which we live, employment is an important part of people's self-perception and their status in society. And therefore, we shouldn't, I think, simply accept that it's only the cash that matters. So that's why, I mean, I think full employment should remain. And I think that in recommending doing what the American Congress voted to do in the 1970s, which was to create a guaranteed employment scheme, that we should be thinking along those lines, where I think on a sort of broader principle, the state's role should be that of, as it were, setting standards and getting the private sector to emulate those standards rather than necessarily regulating. And in that way, I think the state, by offering jobs which were of a sufficient quality, that would actually make it harder for us to have very poor quality, low-paying jobs that we have at the moment. And that in itself, I think, would be an important role in dealing with the issue of in-work poverty, which is where simply returning to full employment. The problem with that is that full employment with low-paying jobs is not necessarily going to answer problem about dealing with poverty.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I've written about this issue, and I'm a big fan of the job guarantee precisely because it preserves the social aspects of work in our society. And I've faced the criticism that people said, well, that keeps the traditional dependency on wage labor and preserves bullshit jobs, as David Graeber called it. But I would disagree, because if you have a job guarantee scheme, this is something that sits in between a traditional labor market and a basic income, which is just a handout. Because what, as far as I can see, it basically does is it decouples the payment for work from the content of the work. And if you then, as a society, determine the areas in which you want to incentivize activity creation. And you mentioned healthcare and elderly care before. I mean, that is an area that is currently underserved. But you could also imagine much more activity in terms of, engagement in communities, arts and culture. So I don't think, societies will run out of ideas for how to spend people's time wisely. But if you disconnect the content from this work from the payment, which effectively takes away the market mechanism, I think that might be a much better way going forward also for social benefits than just handing out money as a basic income.
Yes, I agree. I mean, I don't feel well taken on board, because I don't in fact favour a basic income as such. What I favour is what I call a participation income. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to a long-standing disagreement I've had with the Belgian philosopher Philippe van Parijs, who once wrote an article saying, should surfers be fed? And his answer was yes, and my answer was no. I mean, I think that we have to have some form of conditionality on a basic income. That, in fact, people tend to ignore that. You can't just pay a basic income to everyone, because who is everyone? I mean, is it all German citizens? If so, that violates the Treaty on the European Union. You can't do that. You have to treat everyone who's in Germany or in France or wherever the same. So you then have to decide who gets a basic income, and then you get into a rather difficult issue. So the way I would approach it is to say, well, people do indeed have to qualify, which doesn't necessarily mean paid employment. I mean, clearly full-time education will qualify, or people doing, for example, caring for children or for elderly relatives. There are a variety of things that would qualify people for it, but nonetheless would be a qualifying condition.
Well, I was on the panel with Philippe just, I think, 2 months ago, and especially these points came up. I mean, as long as we have freedom of movement within the European Union, and, well, mind you, it might be under attack at the moment, as long as you have this and the non-discrimination rule, it's very hard to see how you can implement it in any country individually. And also, if it's not means tested in any way, and you pay to everybody, and try to reclaim it via the tax system, and knowing how leaky the tax system is, it's just a waste of public resources.
Well, no, I don't fully agree with that. I think the participation income would work within the European Union. That's one reason I suggested it. I mean, you basically, if you're a French citizen working in Germany, then you would qualify for a basic income that was paid in Germany, or vice versa. So I think that actually, as I said, this condition, which in fact is not very different from the kind of conditions under quite a number of social transfers, would actually be possible to do that. And as for the question about means testing, of course, we do give everyone a tax allowance, which is exactly what this is, except that it's the same for everyone, rather than being going up in value the higher your marginal tax rate. I mean, it's essentially cashing out a tax allowance.
Yes, but I mean, it would probably depend on the level you set it. I mean, if anybody with the right of residence, say in Germany, get a basic income that is a multiple of an average or minimum wage in another country, it would send. I mean, at the moment we don't have welfare tourism, any evidence for this, but something like that would certainly set incentives for people just to move for that.
But they wouldn't qualify necessarily.
How would you distinguish that?
Well, because it would be a participation income, not a universal income. It would be paid unless they were working, or unless they were in education, or unless they were caring. They wouldn't qualify.
So it's based on participation rather than just being resident or citizen.
Or indeed, residence is not enough. No. Or as you say, otherwise people simply arrive at Heathrow and claim it and set off again.
Okay, well that's an important distinction then. So But in this particular area, I mean, there's a lot of need for fundamental rethinking, and especially if some of the traditional work disappears. Of course, one of the transmission belts is that, well, not in the UK, but in insurance-based systems such as Germany, for instance, the way the welfare system is financed is based on work. It's based on the contributions of workers and employers. So there's a lot of problems on the horizon in this area. But let me get to group number 4, which you've also written a lot about, which is taxation. And you made a series of proposals in this area as well. So what do you think in terms of taxation against the backdrop of inequality and these technological developments? What needs to be done in terms of tax reform?
Well, I think the first thing one should stress is that we need to rehabilitate taxation. Mm-hmm. I think our political leaders have done us a gross disservice by not standing up for the fact that if you wish to live in a society, you have to pay for supporting the infrastructure of that society and providing for the needs of education, health, and so on. And I think that it's very illuminating to go back to the speech made by Joseph Schumpeter in 1919, when he was contemplating clearly the competition between communism, socialism on one side and capitalism on the other. And he said, basically, unless capitalism has a proper fiscal system, it's not going to win this competition in the long run. Mm-hmm. And so I think, again, it's something which we used to recognize. I mean, if you look at the Internal Revenue Service building in the United States, it's on the building outside the main entrance, it says, taxation is the price we pay for civilization.
Not many people recognize that in these days.
No, well, I think that's a failure of political leadership. So I think the first thing we have to do is to say, well, actually, I think many individuals are recognizing this. I mean, quite a number of, including very wealthy people, are saying that they recognize that they wouldn't be able to run their businesses if they didn't have roads and so on. So I think that, although there are some who don't recognize it, like some of the people in the newspapers recently, nonetheless, I think there is a recognition amongst many individuals that this is a necessary thing. And then you have to ask the question of what kind of taxes to use in a world where, of course, we're constrained by, particularly by the external effects of globalization and mobility and trade and so on. So I think it does limit. It means we have to rethink some of the things, but nonetheless, I think actually we are beginning to rethink, for example, the role of corporate taxation is beginning to realize that we have to have a multinational agreement, essentially, on this, which we're moving slowly towards.
Yeah, obviously there are massive collective action problems when it comes to international corporate taxation, isn't it? So, I mean, how can you avoid the kind of transfer pricing that we've seen, or just sort of piling up cash in offshore tax havens? How do you get around this? How can you actually make sure that a proper amount of taxation is being paid? And it's quite interesting that, you know, in recent examples where you have had issues about companies not paying enough tax in certain jurisdiction, I find it quite stunning that some of the managers then basically said, we pay our fair share, as if they determine themselves what the fair share actually is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fair share was never the official tax rate. So.
No. And of course, as I think as Warren Buffett famously said, it was wrong that he paid less tax than his secretary did. And yes, I mean, I think that it is going to be hard to do it unless there is, it's a shift, but it's also a return to some degree of a broader ethical view being taken by people who are taking these decisions. But on the other hand, I mean, there's also the fact that, I mean, I think that unless we resolve this, it's not clear we can continue. I mean, I think that unless we can fund, for example, basic provisions of education and health and public administration, which I think, again, has been grossly underfunded in recent years, unless we do that, societies are going to collapse. And I think that Schumpeter was right. It may take some time, but nonetheless, one is seeing some of the things one's seeing, like the political movements and so on, is a reaction to a system that's broken.
And you mentioned in the book that you advocate a top rate of tax of 65% and a broadened tax base, which would also include property taxes on up-to-date property prices. Do you think this? How could you implement this?
Well, property tax is just a scandal. I mean, it is particularly a UK scandal. We don't do what any American small town was able to do, which is to levy a property tax properly. This is totally a failure of political will, not of feasibility. I mean, as I said, every smallish town levies a property tax quite successfully. So that isn't particularly difficult. It's the fact that people are not willing to do this. And of course, part of the reason I wrote the book was to say, well, people can't just wring their hands and say nothing we can do. They can do things, but they have to choose to do it. And unless they do, then I think one's calling their bluff about their concern about inequality. So
they're not really serious about it if they avoid these sort of areas of reform, effectively.
Exactly. And of course, the property tax is a good example where there's no doubt that the imposition of what I've proposed would actually lead to a reduction in prices being obtained for properties at the top end of the market. And I think most people would welcome that.
Most people would say that's a good thing to do, yeah.
Well, put it the other way around. There's a lot of concern expressed about the fact that people are investing in this property as a way of making a lot of money, whereas if one was to return to that kind of tax system, that would immediately wipe out quite a lot of the incentive to do that.
And that leads us, the investment in high-value property leads us directly into the fourth and final group of proposals I would like to talk about, which is saving and investment. One of your proposals is that the government should offer national saving bonds at guaranteed positive interest rates. Do you see that as a problem because there's not enough personal saving for retirement around, or why do you propose this particular reform?
Well, it is rather staggering. I mean, that for getting on for 10 years, we've had essentially zero or close to zero real interest rates. And I think many people are completely at a loss to know what to do because they are rightly wanting to save for their old age. Our state pension system in this country is not particularly generous. There is but all countries, I think, are anxious about providing, for example, for the costs of personal care particularly in later ages. Now, all of these things are good reasons for saving, but if you're essentially saving at negative real interest rates, it's at the very least discouraging. And I think that the government, in fact, in this country used to offer index-linked securities, guaranteeing, I think, 1% real return, which most people today would regard, small savers would regard as a very generous rate of return. And the government can do this because the government can actually, it has the fiscal resources, as it were, to back paying that kind of interest rate. And it's hard for me to understand why, particularly governments, conservative governments on the right, aren't more concerned about small savers, who are at the moment, as I said, baffled by what they're supposed to do.
And I mean that's a proposal for reforming personal savings. But one proposal you put forward, I'm particularly interested also in, is your idea of a public investment authority. Call it sovereign wealth fund, call it public investment fund. There seems to be a lot of interest in this generally, that especially if the relationship identified by Thomas Piketty holds true, that returns on capital on average are higher than a growth rate, that one way of preventing further increase in inequality is effectively re-socializing some of these returns and using public investment vehicles, special purpose vehicles could be one way of doing that. So what would be the structure that you would favor?
Well, I think you mentioned Thomas Piketty and R greater than G, which was emblazoned on T-shirts and so on. But a lot of people said to me, well, his R may be bigger than G, but mine isn't. And there is, of course, a big gap between the rate of return on capital in the sense of what's the rate of profit is, and what gets paid on financial assets. And part of that gap is due to the financial services industry taking often a quite substantial percentage of the return. And that means that it leads to the problem of the low rates of return for savers when faced with, at the same time as a reasonable rate of return on capital as such. So what this is, the way I was thinking about it was in terms of, as it were, the state acting again as an intermediary and distinguishing carefully between, as it were, a beneficial ownership of productive assets and the control of those assets. So I'm not advocating returning to nationalization, but to the state having minority holdings in productive enterprises. And we used in the past to have, the British government used to own, I think, 49% of British Petroleum, for example. It doesn't have to be 49% of it, something less than a controlling interest, would then mean that the government was able to derive the benefits in terms of technological change and growth of enterprises, and that would provide a source of fiscal resources which could be used, for example, to fund guaranteeing a return to small savers or for other purposes.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically advocating step one of the two-step proposal that Giacomo Corneo, an Italian economist who teaches in Berlin, put forward. So basically he actually suggested in the second step that in some key industries, the public shareholding should actually exercise influence on management or take over management effectively in some cases as well. But I mean, how would you fund such a scheme? I mean, what we did about 18 months ago or so, I think, is taking this basic idea and linking it to some of the reform proposals for the Eurozone. One of the key elements that is missing, it's often mentioned as missing in the Eurozone, is a fiscal capacity. And rather than introducing Eurozone-wide taxes, which seems to be quite a significant way off, one of the things that I've written about was taking this idea of a investment fund or sovereign wealth fund that could be debt financed with a one-off emission of joint liability bonds that would be paid off over the maturity rather than being rolled over perpetually, and then using these returns, splitting these returns between creating some sort of fiscal capacity for the Eurozone and increasing the size of the fund. Would some vehicles like this, I mean, I think what we do wrong in Europe at the moment is not using finance as a tool for, as Robert Schiller would say, the good society, right? So we are very suspicious when it comes to finance, even though finance as such is neither positive nor negative. It's what you use it for. So, I mean, do you see also scope of action for sort of reclaiming finance for these sort of socially beneficial purposes?
No, exactly. I fully agree with you that you say that finance is it is properly used, is a very effective instrument. It's obviously one of the things that allowed the world to develop in a number of ways. So yes, I absolutely agree with you that one has to think creatively about what the nature of that finance is. What you suggested seems to me, I think, a very good idea, particularly given the very low rates of interest at the moment which governments can borrow, and given the fact that, as I said, the rate of return on capital remains quite high. Filling that gap between, or using that gap to begin such a sovereign wealth fund seems to me an excellent idea. And in fact, a number of countries, of course, Norway,
of course,
built its
doing this
sovereign wealth fund largely out of receipts from the North Sea oil. But France has also, I think, started a sovereign wealth fund in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, some of the distinctions that I've heard is that you shouldn't call it a sovereign wealth fund because sovereign wealth fund, one of the determining factors is that, as you said, it's basically created out of surplus sales of commodities or trade surpluses, whereas what we suggested here is a debt finance instrument, so it should be an investment fund, or it doesn't matter what you really call it, but the The question is, effectively in these current market circumstances, and I think they are key, especially if you maybe involve the ECB in one way or the other in financing, such an investment fund, you could basically raise capital for close to zero, and that could open up quite a lot of opportunities. And another criticism that I've heard is that yes, it works fine in theory, but not on that scale. So you couldn't do that on a Eurozone wide scale. Say you create a fund that might be 1%, 2% GDP in terms of the size, that the sort of arbitrage effects that you use by effectively borrowing and then investing wouldn't work on that scale. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, I don't see that as. I don't follow that argument. I can't see quite how it works. Well, the point I would make, though, is, of course, that one of the problems is that we focus almost exclusively when looking at the fiscal position of governments or of the Eurozone as a whole on only one side of the account. We focus basically on the debt side of the account. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we don't look at the asset side of the account. And whereas the right thing to look at is the net worth position. And that seems to me is what, in fact, interestingly, one of the students here in Oxford has been looking at this. It's the net worth position that may be more relevant to determining the interest rate at which the Eurozone or national governments could borrow, because that clearly determines the capacity to repay. And if alongside your debt, which may be quite large in terms of this financing, is a block of assets which are, in fact, guaranteeing.
Large.
It's also large and guaranteeing the fact that repayments can be made. And if you're a lender, that's clearly what you're concerned with. So I do think, again, our leaders have done a disservice by focusing so exclusively on the debt position.
Oh, absolutely. And there hasn't been a balance sheet approach at all to policy making. No.
And I was giving an interview for a German newspaper, and I said, what is the net worth position of Germany? I mean, we know about their debt position, but what is the net worth position? And I'm not sure we know the answer to that. Whereas,
well, we do know that Germany has had an investment gap for the last 15 years and that the national capital stock is depreciating.
Yes, well, exactly. Yes, quite.
So, and that just goes to show again that nobody takes a balance sheet approach to fiscal policy and just look at the net liabilities. I mean, obviously, being a German, I find this highly frustrating that it's basically a tool of public communications and PR that you basically wave a bank account statement in front of the public saying, "Oh, we have zero new debt," but not mentioning at the same time that Autobahn bridges have to be closed because they become unsafe, school buildings are falling apart, and so on and so forth. So it's highly bizarre.
I totally agree with you. Yes.
Oh dear.
And if you, at an individual level, I mean, someone would just laugh at you if you said just focus on the mortgage, not on the fact they own a house.
Well, on the personal level, it's almost the other way around, isn't it? You present a nice car, but don't mention that it's completely borrowed. So, well, I mean, let's come to the final part, maybe. And it's a highly interesting conversation, and obviously we could go on for hours. But if you were a European policymaker or a leading policymaker in one of the leading European countries, where would you start? Given that where we are, what would be your top priority policy changes to be implemented in the short term, medium, and long term?
In a way, I hesitate to sort of say of my 15 proposals that one is my favourite. What I was trying to do was offer, as it were, a menu of choice, and so.
But maybe in terms of feasibility, say, I mean, we work with a lot of policymakers who would like to get going, but find the political process as being a main obstacle for actually getting through. So maybe prioritizing ideas that have sort of the least resistance against them.
Right. Well, there's one aspect which we haven't covered so far in the discussion, which I tried to stress in the book, which is the intergenerational inequality.
Okay.
I think that in the past, I think we haven't worried too much about it because there was a general presumption that our children were going to be better off than we were, and so on, and our grandchildren even better off, etc. So I think there was a feeling that, in some sense, growth and rising living standards would offset whatever disadvantage we might be passing on. But I think that's no longer true. I mean, I don't think we can be sure that our children and grandchildren are going to have a significantly higher living standard, may well be a lower living standard if some of the environmental damage and so on that we're doing is not offset. So I think that this is now an issue, and it's an issue which I think, again, features to some extent in political movements and so on. So I think if I had to choose one thing, I think it would be investment in children. And this is an idea which has had a certain amount of interest in members of in discussions about social policy in the European Union, of a Europe-wide, in this case, basic income for children. Mm-hmm. That is, guaranteeing that each child would receive at least a certain fraction of the country's median income as a payment as Kindergeld or Allocation Familiale or whatever form the scheme would take. And that, of course, would be a rather straightforward way of putting a reflationary element into the budget. And it would almost certainly, I think, since the people receiving it are likely to spend it.
So reclaiming an active fiscal policy to actually set the continent up and spur activity.
Yes, and I think its appeal would be partly that we're investing in our future, which I think that most people find that a fairly persuasive argument. It would also, of course, mean that some countries it would be more important than others, and depending on the size of the population and growth rate and so on.
And it should maybe also be focused on sort of reigniting or sort of making believable again the promise of cohesion. Whereas, yes. in the European Union, cohesion policy has not been as successful as promised. So, and inequality between countries obviously is a political problem for the European Union as a whole.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. So, Tony, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground here, and well, I'm sure this topic is not going to go away anytime soon. So maybe, and I hope we have the opportunity to come back to this at a later stage and sort of discuss a few more ideas in more depth. By that time, hopefully, also against the backdrop that some of the proposals that you put forward have already been implemented. That would be great. Thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.